Here we go. What's up, Evil Dead fans? We are on our way to Evil Dead Rise, which is coming out April 20th. And because of that, Danny, my good friend over there, drinking some coffee in Arizona, and I are covering everything that's like Evil Dead adjacent. We've done Evil Dead 2013, we've done Drag Me to Hell, we have done Darkman, which was a lot of fun. And now, because Bruce Campbell was in another franchise, we are covering Maniac Cop. Danny, I am guessing that you are a big Maniac Cop fan.
I am a big Maniac Cop fan. I'm a big fan of Bill Lustig. I'm a big fan of Larry Cohen, the writer, uh, Tom Atkins, Bruce Campbell, Sam Raimi, who has a little cameo in this movie. This is like a meeting of all of the minds of horror. And there we are. Yep. So that picture was from a few weeks back at the Nighthawk Cinema by my house. They were doing a screening of Bill Lustig's 1982 Vigilante, which stars the late Robert Forster and Fred Williamson. And it's basically like, what if Death Wish took place in, you know, what if Death Wish was a blue collar movie? That's
Hmm.
basically the plot. It's like these blue collar guys that um, just go after like the rapists and the criminals, and it's nothing like too crazy and original, but it's like a nice gritty early 80s action movie. And we got to watch the screening, and uh, Lustig was there. He did a Q&A, and he was just such a cool guy. I wore my Maniac shirt. He approved. The other guy in that picture, by the way, is the writer of Vigilante. I want to give him some credit too.
Oh,
I'm in Arizona. I don't have his name on hand, but he was there as well, and the two of them talked about it. But I loved Maniac. Is unabashedly one of my favorite movies. I live by the Verrazano Bridge, which I call Maniac Point because that's the famous scene where uh, Tom Savini is in the car and he created a blow up of his head so that um, the Frank, the maniac, can jump up and blow it away with a shotgun in an amazing Tom Savini head explosion effect.
yeah.
Uh, and then, of course, Maniac Cop. He directed all three, or he directed. Lustig directed. I believe he's credited with the first two, and then I think he like shared the directing credit on part three.
Okay.
But Larry Cohen also one of my favorites. He directed Q the Winged Serpent. He directed The
Oh,
Stuff. Uh, God Told Me to. A whole bunch of late 70s, early 80s, really grindhouse 80s movies that like I watched a documentary and I actually reviewed the interviewer of that documentary for Geeks of Doom called King Cohen. If anybody gets a chance, it's fantastic.
okay.
Cohen was this, he was a renegade filmmaker. He would basically send his crew out on the street with no permits. Uh, he filmed Q the Winged Serpent in 1982, I believe. He just sent like his actors up to the top of the Chrysler building with guns and had them fire into the sky. Like he was insane. Like he would have been
Jesus.
arrested today. You've heard the story about how during Cannibal Holocaust, like the director got arrested because they thought he murdered his crew because
I
they
think,
thought it
yeah.
like if America treated like movie directors like Italy did in the early 80s, Cohen would have been arrested as well. Um,
Wow.
he also was a writer. He did Phone Booth. He wrote the movie Phone Booth with Kiefer Sutherland and Colin Farrell,
I
which
see.
was one of my favorite like close, tight thrillers, contained thrillers. That's the phrase I was looking for. So this is really just a meeting, and then of course the two main stars of the movie are Tom Atkins and Bruce Campbell. So this is just a meeting of all things that are grindhouse and like low budget awesome of the
Yes.
1980s.
Yes.
And it's weird that it's really a late 80s movie, and it's also really, really poignant in some of the things that get said and how
Y-
topical those things would become in years later.
Yes, sir.
Uh,
Yeah. It's funny.
Quite controversial
Yeah.
to probably some people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It almost felt a little awkward or weird watching something about this, right? And talking about cops so much and cops being dangerous. Um, I was going to say that a few of the things that you said, Joe Bob Briggs also said, because Joe Bob Briggs must be very similar to you and have a real appreciation of William Lustig and Larry Cohen, because I mean he's had Q the Winged Serpent on the last drive-in. I think they did Maniac Cop 1 and 2 back to back for one last drive-in, and for me that was my exposure to all of those films. And I feel like some of the things I might bring to the discussion today might just be quoting Joe Bob, but you can tell that he really does appreciate. And also, they showed Maniac on the last drive-in too.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So I mean, he would have been a lot younger. Probably. I don't know, maybe in his 20s or 30s when those movies came out, right? And he just has an appreciation, I think, for everything that you just talked about.
Yeah. Shout out to Joe Spinell, who's the actor from. I called him Frank. That's his character name. Joe Spinell is Maniac. Uh, Here's a guy who was in The Godfather and then was the gangster that Rocky worked for in the original Rocky. And now, a few years later, he's jumping up on the hoods of cars under the Verrazano and blowing away Tom Savini. So it's and skinning girls for their scalps to put on his mannequins. Uh, you don't get movies like this anymore. You don't get
No.
movies like Maniac, Maniac Cop, Q the Winged Serpent. It's why I love this movie. It feels like all of these like crazy minds came together.
Yes.
And it's also bizarre, spoiler alert, you have the lead actor in the movie who you're led to believe is Tom Atkins' character, who you follow for the first hour of the movie, then basically just gets ceremoniously tossed out a window by the maniac cop himself, Matt Cordell.
Yeah.
And the movie then like basically transfers over to Bruce Campbell. And then
Yeah.
the movie does that again in the sequel because Bruce Campbell basically comes back and you're like, oh, there's my main character. There's Jack. And he's killed off almost instantly. And the movie like transfers to another main character. So
Yeah.
it also kind of subverts your expectations uh, in what you're expecting. Also, the whole story of Matt Cordell. Like I've seen this movie probably 10 times from beginning to end in my life, and I still don't know if Matt Cordell is supposed to be a zombie, if he's supposed to be some kind of like supernatural being, or if he's just the biggest, toughest cop in the world who, it's they are not very explicit with what he is.
Right.
They do in the sequel basically turn him into like a Jason Lives style monster.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen the images from it because I remember watching the last drive-in, and I watched, because when I watch the last drive-in, I don't sit there and watch the whole thing straight through because I got a lot going on in my house. So I remember watching the end of this movie and then a little bit of the second movie, and I've seen images of Cordell, and he like almost has like the skeleton kind of face, and
Yeah.
he does look like Jason Lives. Yeah, I think that in this first one, he's more like Michael Myers, at least like Michael Myers in like the first movie, where it's like you're not really sure what he is. Is he just this like crazy killer? Is he not? Um, what's really interesting about this movie is that Bruce Campbell is the main guy, and we're so used to Bruce Campbell being goofy and silly, and he's pretty much just a straight man the entire movie. And
Yeah.
and watching it from the beginning, I'm like, he's actually pretty unlikable, right? Because the way they introduce him, first off, the movie does a great job of setting up the fear throughout the city, and like, oh, there's this cop, and so you see this like this response from the citizens where like this one woman shoots this cop because she thinks he's the maniac cop. People are all worried, and then you see this one woman who thinks that her wife might be the Maniac Cop, and he's putting on his uniform just like Cordell does in the beginning of the movie. And then you find out that that guy is Bruce Campbell. Now, Bruce Campbell leaves not to go kill people, but to go have an affair. And the movie kind of treats it like the wife who thought he was a killer, the wife who he was committing adultery on. It's just like, fuck her. Who cares? We really care about the woman he's with, you know? And so I felt bad for the wife kind of. And I was like, oh, well, you know, she just kind of gets brushed over.
I think her character though serves a bigger point in one of the things that the script is doing, which is really showing the effect that being a cop has on cops and on the people around them. Like the script goes into very vivid detail about, you know, Frank McRae, Tom Atkins' character. We're told that his partner died and that within a month he was effectively suicidal, and that his gun went off. You know, we're told that, you know, a lot of cops are in therapy, and, you know, whether it's marriage counseling or they're in therapy because they're like depressed and suicidal and angry. And these are things that would come out much later on, where like now there's statistics about, you know, what happens to cops. The suicide rates are very high. Divorce rates are very high amongst police officers. And it's got to be a combination of, you know, the stress that they go through on a daily basis, the stress that their family goes through on a daily basis. But then there's also the other side where Larry Cohen, as the writer, is very apt to show in these like news clip interviews about how the citizenry of New York is afraid of cops. And he doesn't just make it, you know, like what it would become as we move forward in the real world, where very often it goes into, it becomes like a whole race thing. Even though there's the one black guy that they show that really like it's almost like he's looking into the freaking future. He's like, you know, people, he's like, they're shooting at us. They're shooting us in the back. They're, you know, they're claiming that anything we're holding is a weapon. And I'm like, oh my God, like those are actual news stories from like the late 90s and early 2000s and 2010s, etc. But then there's also like just generic like white people talking about how they're afraid of the cops. And like, you know, and I think that there is, to an extent, even amongst good people who, you know, do respect law and order. I mean, I went to Tombstone, Arizona yesterday, where nobody is more respected than law and order in that place. I mean, they celebrate Wyatt Earp like he is, on this Easter day, a version of Jesus.
Oh my
and
God.
You know, and despite that, like there are people that, you know, hey, look, we know this, right? The worst, and I tell this to my students all the time when I teach like criminal justice classes. There's nothing worse, even if you are a law-abiding citizen, than being pulled over by a cop, than being stopped by a police officer. You always have this, for some reason, you get nervous, even if you've done nothing wrong, or even if you've done something wrong, but nothing too wrong. You know, even if you were going 70 in a 50-mile-an-hour zone, for some reason you're like, oh fuck, like what's going to happen? And I think that's, you know, I think this movie, which came out in 1988, writes and directs itself in a way that really hits both sides of this, like the stress and the effect on their lives and their families' lives that just being a cop is and being a cop has, and the fear that the general public has of cops in general, let alone if they become maniac cops.
Yes. You know, it's funny because, you know, you are in Arizona right now, but you live in New York. I lived in New York for the majority of my life. And so, you know, it's where we live and grew up. And the New York of our childhood, which in 1988, we'd be like 6 years old, 5, 6, 7 years old, right? That's a different New York from the New York now, right? And you just look at this movie and the way that people kind of act around cops in this movie. It has changed, like you said. Just the overall look of New York feels completely different. I like watching these 80s movies, these 70s movies, and just being like, oh yeah, I remember when New York was like this, where like every subway car had graffiti on it, and
I I
right,
mean, I have stories of like my parents. We also grew up before cell phones.
right,
It's a lot easier today when we can track where our kids are going with cell phones. But
right,
uh, I I grew up where even in the early to mid '90s, like my friends started wanting to go to like Times Square and the city
hmm,
probably when I was about 13 to 14, and that would make it like 95, 96. And my mom especially was like, I don't want you going to the taking the subway to the city.
right,
And like I would have to have been with a large group. I would have had to have a pocket full of quarters so that I could call on a payphone to let them know that I was there.
yeah,
And yeah, I show my students all the time. I show them when when I teach criminal justice, we go into the different styles of policing, and we talk about like the Giuliani era, where basically it's called broken windows policing, where you crack down on all of these small quality of life crimes, and
right,
that's what Giuliani did. And I show them pictures of the porn theaters, the drug dealers, the
right,
prostitution, the squeegee men,
right,
and like you said, the graffiti
yeah,
everywhere.
yeah,
Like a lot of my students take the train to school every day, and I show them pictures of what a train used to look like in like 1983, and they're
yeah,
like blown away.
yeah,
They don't understand, and it really is. It's a bygone era
yeah.
that these guys were writing and directing it.
Right. So let's use that to kind of bring back into the narrative of the movie. So one other actor that we haven't really mentioned is the love interest, played by Laureen Landon. She's Officer Teresa Mallory, and she's the one that Bruce Campbell's having the affair with. And it's funny because when you first get introduced to her, she's pretending to be a prostitute so she can bust Johns. And there's this great scene where this guy pulls up and he's kind of flirting with her, want to go somewhere, and he asked her that question that you're supposed to ask a prostitute in movies or whatever, where you're like, "Are you a cop?" And then she kind of lets him go, essentially. But it's funny because there's not really a lot of character development or anything like that in this movie. It's pretty much just a straight up thriller trying to uncover what's going on. I think that really the real true depth is what's going on with the maniac cop himself. Like why is he the way that he is, right? And you mentioned before, you really made a really great point about when you get pulled over by a cop, you get scared, even if you haven't done anything. And my wife has kind of negative experiences with cops, and she sometimes has an opinion about them, and sometimes she refers to them as like the cop cult, right? And she says that like cops kind of are always with each other. They're always like hanging out together. They have the similar mindset. And this movie, I feel like, really represents that, right? Because with the maniac cop himself, with Cordell, he is an officer that's like real proud of himself, and he's this big guy. At one point, they say that like he's there looking at clippings of his own like arrests and articles, and he ends up having this affair with this other cop. And so it's like in modern movies, a lot of times when you have cops that sort of have this shady past and stuff, they start getting involved with criminals. But in this movie, the woman that he's having an affair with is this other cop who loves him, is like obsessed with him. And she's essentially like feeding him information so he can get
Yeah,
his
I mean, and
revenge.
and even then, and that goes back to what we were saying before. When Cordell dies, she apparently throws herself out a window, and
Right.
but like there's another person who works for the police department who, a police officer dies, and her response is, basically a suicidal impulse,
Yeah.
um, and and then she basically is working to help get him to get revenge for basically. So I think we should talk about Matt Cordell. Matt Cordell is played by Robert Zadar, who the big joke of this movie is that Bruce Campbell, of course, is known for his chin. His first book was called If Chins Could Kill. I actually have that signed by him at a book signing.
That's awesome.
But Robert Z'Dar has the chin. Like, this man has a face that is like chiseled out of a fucking mountain.
Yes.
And he's massive. If you don't know who Robert Z'Dar is, he's also the bad guy in Samurai Cop, which is the greatest bad movie of all time. It is like legendarily awful. But yeah, Z'Dar plays Matt Cordell, and basically he's a shoot first, ask no questions, ask questions later cop. He's considered a hero in the police department, but he basically is, before he becomes something otherworldly, he's essentially kind of a maniac cop. He just goes out there and, goes after criminals.
Yeah.
And he basically becomes a scapegoat for the city, trying to like police their own. And so they basically throw him under the bus and arrest him and throw him in. They said Sing Sing.
Sing Sing.
And they put him right in with, like, they say all the criminals that he caught.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this like, you're a David Lynch fan. He did Eastern Promises, right?
No, that's Cronenberg.
That is Cronenberg. Oh, okay. Did you see Eastern Promises?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Because I was going to say there's like this, Eastern Promises, 1988 Eastern Promises-esque slow motion naked shower fight scene.
Yes.
Where he's left like with his face just being stabbed and slashed, and he's basically killed. We're told he's killed.
Right.
And somehow he's back, and the movie does a great job. Lustig does a great job of building this character through shadow, through just the way the camera shows him. Like my daughter, when I got home, when Athena and I got home from Tombstone yesterday, Charlotte was laying in bed watching the Harry Potter movies on TV, and she asked, like, how did they make Hagrid look so big next to the rest of the cast?
Right.
And it made me think of the way, because Robert Z'Dar is huge. He's a massive person,
right.
But he also looks so much more imposing. There's right at the beginning, this like blonde woman is running away from these like two thugs in the street.
Right.
She sees a cop. She runs up to him, and he like it's a WWE, choke slam, picks her up, snaps her neck, throws her down.
Right.
And they film him in such a way that he looks like you mentioned Michael Myers. He looks like a Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers type.
Right.
And everyone else next to him looks, and it helps that like the woman that is kind of helping him out is this small, diminutive woman who walks with a cane. So he always just gives off this just hulking appearance.
Right.
And he's filmed in shadow, so you get like glimpses of maybe his eyes, but nothing more. You don't see really until the very end of the movie. You don't see his full face with all the scars and the what would become that like skull mask that he kind of like burned skull mask that he has in parts 2 and 3.
Yeah,
where he's effectively just a monster at that point.
Right. And yeah, you're absolutely right that like the way that he's filmed, it's always like he's in silhouette, or you can, not see him just head on. But it's funny too, because in the beginning, a lot of his kills and what he does are like, oh, this is what a cop would do. Like you kind of picture Larry Cohen and, William Lustig sitting there talking about, okay, well, he's a cop. So like, we got to do some cop stuff with the kills. Okay. All right. Well, at first a woman's going to run up to him thinking he's a good cop, but then he's the maniac cop. He's going to kill her. Then this other guy, he's going to be at a traffic light, and he's going to walk up with his billy club and knock on the window and make the kid come out. And it's so funny because he doesn't talk throughout the whole movie. When he gets up with the billy club, he knocks on the window. The guy, the kid he pulls over kind of starts talking, and then he just points, and the kid comes out, and he just kills the kid.
Scene. I like when he walks out in front of the car, and he just kind of sit like let's go. Get out here with he doesn't say anything, but like it's like, oh, all right, the cop wants me to get out of the car.
Right. Yeah, and you know the drill, because that's the best part of the beginning of this movie, is that you know what it's like to have a cop kind of stop you, or to go up to a cop if you need help. You know that feeling, and they kind of twist it on its head. And I think my favorite kill of the movie is the third person, where it's this guy that he puts in handcuffs, and they do this kind of fun shot where it shows his hands behind his back and there's blood coming down. You know, that's such a like a horror movie image right there. It's like, okay, well, it's about a cop, so we have to have someone in handcuffs and they're bleeding in the handcuffs. And so the guy's running, and then he catches up to him, and it happens to be fresh cement, and he just shoves his head into the fresh cement. That's my favorite kill. And then I love when they cut to the next day, and his body's there all rigid, and there's someone with a jackhammer trying to get him out. Just that's awesome.
I also love that the guy in handcuffs is using like his nose to press intercom buttons.
Yes.
And everybody in 1980, like mid 80s New York is like, get the fuck out of here, dude.
Right.
He's screaming, help me, help me. Hey, he's going to kill me. He's going to kill me. Get the fuck out of here, man. It's like that. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
It's this great time capsule of a movie that really captures what New York felt like in that time. And, it just really plays upon the idea of like, okay, we're in a crowded city. And I think that was why I kind of forgive us covering this for our Evil Dead Rise, because Evil Dead Rise, just like Scream 6, takes place in a major city. And so I think that this movie shows how you can have that kind of fear, that slasher killer fear, in a place where there's people all around you. It's a crowded area, but they still can get to you, you know?
Especially, and this goes back to something we just kind of touched on. One of the things growing up in New York is, when you live in the suburbs, it's like, don't talk to strangers. When you're in New York, that's like heightened. It's like, don't look at people. it's not don't talk to strangers. It's don't even fucking look at people.
Yeah.
If you're on the subway, don't stare at anybody, because, we both work in schools. 90% of the fights that start in schools are because, what are you looking at?
Right.
It's taken up to a degree where, like there's violence that takes place in cities, obviously, but we don't associate cities with horror movies. But if you're a slasher killer, what better place to be than a city? You have victims everywhere and by the thousand. One of the things I did really like about Scream 6 was the incorporation of the city, fighting through apartment buildings, like fighting. Did you see Scream 6 yet?
No.
Come on, man.
I was gonna beat me up. Oh Jesus! Okay.
No, because I don't want to spoil anything. But you saw it in the preview. There's a scene on the subway. There's a scene where they're fighting through apartments, and they have to make it from like one apartment window to another, which is right next door. And they like put a ladder across, and now you're climbing over this like alley in between apartment buildings. And it's like that. As somebody who lives in an apartment building in a city, that's real. Like that can happen. And it adds to, there's a scene in a convenience store in Scream 6, like they're in like one of those corner stores. And, a lot of like movies like that, like Maniac Cop, they feel like very home to me. Whereas like, Halloween and, Friday the 13th and those types of movies, which are, camps or suburbs, it's, to me, it's very foreign. Like I'm sitting on a patio right now in like a villa community. Like this is very foreign to me. I'm used to like, people, everybody who walks by with their dog says, "Hey, good morning." Well, I'm like, okay, like, good morning. Like,
Yeah.
Like, you don't just say good morning to strangers in Brooklyn. Not that Brooklyn is like full of assholes, but it's just it's part of being in the city is you don't talk to people, you don't look at people, you kind of stay, you're with your group of people, and that's it.
Yeah, I believe me. I miss it sometimes. I kind of just miss all the people being around, and everyone kind of being in their own little worlds. Because people here say hi to you all the time, and people are nicer in Texas in general. But I do miss that New York feeling. You mentioned before in Scream 6 that there's sort of sequences that highlight it being in New York. I think that's one of the things that's really great about this movie are the different set pieces, right? Like making the city work for your action. Because this movie, besides it being like a kind of a slasher, it's also like a straight up kind of action cop thriller. And so I remember when I first saw it with the Joe Bob, Last Drive-In show, there's the part where Mallory has to kind of get out of police custody because Cordell is there trying to get her. And so she like breaks out the window and then climbs down. And then the rest of the movie is essentially just like one big car chase sequence until the very, very end. And, with the Last Drive-In, they cut away to Joe Bob talking about behind the scenes stuff. And, he's explaining what's going on. I remember that he was talking about like poor Bruce Campbell in the back of the van, the cop van, just getting beaten up because they're making all these sharp turns and he's just flying around the van.
I was thinking, like, again, there was a case, I think, in Baltimore where cops threw a guy in the back of like a paddy wagon like that, and they didn't secure him, and like he ended up like dying later on from like injuries, like spinal injuries. And I'm like watching Bruce Campbell get flown around the back seat of that thing. I'm like, yep, okay, that makes sense. Like, yeah, you can get if you're not tied down, you're gonna get fucked up in the back of that thing.
Yeah, and it's just the chase is really awesome, and I love watching these old movies because there's no CGI or anything like that. It's just straight up stunt people, real life. They're driving on a real actual street, and I remember that Joe Bob really focused heavy on that last sequence where they drive the paddy wagon off the pier.
Oh, you can see the stuntman do a full flip. And I'm watching that, and I'm as I'm watching it, I'm thinking, is that just a dummy?
Right.
But then, like, you watch him hit the water, and you watch him pop up immediately. So
Right.
either it's the best dummy in the world, or that was a fucking guy flipping off that paddy wagon as it's flying into the water.
Yeah.
It is one of the best stunt crash scenes that I've ever seen in a movie that you would not expect,
right.
This type of like action movie stunt work.
Right. And even when Tom Atkins dies, they throw him out the window. I thought that looked really great where he lands on the cab. There's just a couple of really great sequences. It's almost a little bit like Terminator, because like especially in the original Terminator, they're arrested by the cops. They have to get away from the Terminators in the police precinct. There's a couple of sequences like that. There's sequences like we talked about that woman with the cane who was his lover. Like at one point, Tom Atkins walks in and Cordell's just smashing her up against the wall. One with the cane. He's just so brutal and ruthless, and the stunt work in this movie is just so good.
Yeah.
So, what do you call it? What do you have anything else to add to our Maniac of New York discussion? Maniac Cop, not Maniac
of New York.
That's a comic book. That's a comic book that I, for my company, I promote, Aftershock. Maniac Cop.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like so much of Larry Cohen's work as a writer, I think it's ahead of its time. I think it's prophetic in a way. I love the renegade style of the filmmaking.
Right.
I love the way William Lustig incorporates, New York, as you said, and it's you get as Evil Dead fans who've grown up with the goofier side of Bruce Campbell. It is kind of nice to see him just be, a straight man, kind of like, this idea that he's like, he's cheating on his wife, but obviously like him and his wife is like, there's a lot going on there that like doesn't get explored. Like his wife is like a very damaged person. And, to see him be like this kind of Lothario type, who is just a straight, cop action star with no quips, no comedy, no nothing, is very rare. Even Tom Atkins, by 1988, he had done Night of the Creeps, he had done Halloween 3, so many of his movies, The Fog, of course, even though he is like that consummate straight man, he also has these like hilarious one-liners, especially coming off Night of the Creeps, which was 1986.
Yeah.
Where he was, thrill me. Your dates are here, but they're dead. Every line in that movie is like a quotable quip. And in this movie, he's just like a sad older cop that's like, trying to figure out what's going on and like struggling to come to the realization that it could be this mythical figure, Matt Cordell, back from the dead. It's just an interesting movie. And it's, we talk about this a lot. This movie is like 85 minutes long. It flies fucking by.
Yep.
I watched this the other night. It's on Tubi. It's streaming on Tubi. Maniac Cop. Jesus.
We're fucking up that title, man.
Maniac Cops 2 and 3 are on Shudder, and Maniac is on Shudder, but Maniac Cop is on streaming. Tubi. I think it's free on either Vudu or Tubi. I watched it on Tubi on my phone. I was exhausted the other night. I had watched Yellow Jackets for our Yellow Jackets review. You can check that out on the channel now, episode 3. And we were going to record Maniac Cop right after. So I watched Maniac Cop and I was exhausted. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to be able to watch this whole movie. And this movie's like 80-something minutes. It flies by. There's no break. Every scene is important to either the plot or the action. And they just, 85 minutes and done, and movies today, my biggest complaint, I feel all the time walking out of a movie is that was really good, except it didn't need to be an hour and 55 minutes. It didn't need to be 2 hours and 20 minutes. It didn't need to be 3 hours long. I think about so many movies I've seen where that is my lead critique, and I feel like it makes me feel like, I have no attention span anymore. It's like, no, you can tell a story without having to drag things out, and keep things going. 85 minutes. What a breath of fresh air. I'm breathing in this wonderful fresh air.
It's funny. I'm embarrassed to say this, Danny, but I've only seen 2 movies with Tom Atkins. I've only seen this movie, and I've seen Halloween 3, and then that's it.
Well, you have to see Night of the Creeps. I got to see that so I'm lucky. I know you're currently living in like the birthplace of Alamo Drafthouse. Back in Brooklyn, I have an Alamo, which is about 25 minutes away with no traffic.
Right.
I have a Nighthawk Cinema, which is about 25 minutes away with no traffic. And they just put up an Alamo in your old neck of the woods in Staten Island, which is also 25 minutes away with no traffic. So I always have these like great theaters near me that show older, like retro movies. I got to see Night of the Creeps in the movie theater not that long ago. I got to see Vigilante by Bill Lustig in the theater not that long ago. Like, I feel like most of the movies that I actually go to the movies to see nowadays are actually classic movies, which I'm perfectly fine with. I just read this morning, Return of the Jedi is coming back to theaters for its 40th anniversary in April. I don't know. Are you you're not a Star Wars fan, are you? That's
Come
a joke.
on.
I'm kidding.
Yeah,
I know. Tune into Comic Books Transformed on YouTube to hear him and Brian talk about all things Star Wars.
Yes.
But, TV, etc.
It's funny because like I remember that Night of the Creeps trailer because it would play on a VHS that I would watch a lot, and I was like, oh, that looks like a lot of fun, and I remember that line that he'd say, your dates are here. I remember that. I mean, he just is very charismatic. He's all in Search of Darkness, all those movies, and
I mean that's why Darcy loves him.
Yeah, he's a horror staple, just like Joe Bob that we mentioned before, and so I need to watch more of his movies. That might be something we rectify after Evil Dead Rise. But right now we're on our march to Evil Dead Rise. Do you think, Danny, that we have a chance to do one more before the movie or no? It's the 9th. It's April 9th. The movie comes out the 20th, I believe.
Yeah. I mean, it depends what so basically we've been dabbling in Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell style movies. So I'm up to do anything. The director, Lee Cronin, I think has one horror movie that he did before.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
The Hole in the Ground, I think it's called.
Okay. Have you seen it?
I did, but it was a while ago, and it was and I think it was kind of like it was one of those where I was like, yeah, I liked it, but like now that he's directing Evil Dead, it's a movie I'm like a lot more interested in giving a rewatch to.
Yeah.
So we could do that to kind of give the director some props before we go see Evil Dead Rise.
I think that's
I know
smart.
you had mentioned Bubba Hotep also, which has Bruce Campbell and a connection to our channel, as we've interviewed several Lansdales, Joe Lansdale, Keith Lansdale, and Bubba Hotep is a Joe Lansdale story, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So, and Bruce Campbell's in that. So we could, we'll definitely do one more movie next week. I like, pairing this up with our Yellow Jackets coverage, which is up on the channel. You can watch our season 1 recap, and we have episodes 1 through 3 up there now.
Yes. Yeah, man. Yeah, it's a good time to be a fan of the Lacercast because we're talking about stuff that we really love, and we want to hear what you guys have to say about these movies that we're reviewing, these classic movies. And I'm sure you guys are excited about Evil Dead Rise, which we're going to be covering very soon. So thank you so much, guys. Happy Easter. And Danny and I will see you next week from some more Road to